All right, so let's get started with the SUBD process. So if we look at the menus in Rhino, one of the menu items is SUBDs or subdivisions. We're going to start out with just a box. And for the purpose of this, it doesn't really matter the proportions of the box. As soon as we create that primitive, you'll see that it can toggle. If we run the SUBD display toggle command, it can toggle back and forth using the space bar, as are all of the elements that have been created with SUBDs, between a box shape or primitive shape and a smoothed shape. One of the things you'll want to do is to enable sub-object selection in your filter settings. And in this case, we want to select surfaces and faces. So depending on whether you're on a Mac or Windows, the keyboard commands might be a little different. I'm using a Mac. And if I select a face and I hold down Command Shift and pull on the gumball, it will extrude another shape. I can do the same thing on each side. If you want to maintain the orthogonal direction, make sure you're clicking on the arrow and not on the little box widget. So I'm clicking on each face. I've got my filters set for surfaces and faces for sub-objects. I'm using Command and Shift or Control Shift, and I'm pulling on the arrows to extrude additional faces on this object. I'm doing that all the way around so that I can get a symmetrical, more or less, object in all directions. And right now we're not worried about the exact proportions. We just want to get the workflow down. Okay, so once we have this shape, and the camera's kind of distorting this a bit, but once we have this shape, we can now deselect our sub-objects or disable our filters, click on the entire object, initiate our SUBD toggle, and we begin to get a form that is somewhat like what we want to end up with, except that we have not creased the edges, so the edges here are rounded. What we would like is to have the inside corners still be rounded, but the outside faces to be flat. So if we go back to our primitive shape, we can set our selection filter to curves and edges instead of surfaces or faces. And in our next video, we'll look at creasing to create a more crisp geometry that has flat faces that can be assembled into a more complex structure. Okay, so here we are with our SUBD model, and we're getting ready to add some creases to this form. So up in your SUBD menu, we can look at the edit tools, and we can insert a hard crease. You can also look for this in the icons in the tab for SUBD tools. It's asking us which edges we want to crease. And so, for example, if I window and select these 4 edges, and I say OK, now that's got a hard crease. If we go back to our SUBD toggle, we'll see that the ones that have not been creased are still rounded, but this edge is now giving us a flat face. So we can go back to our primitive shape, which makes it a lot easier to select the sub-object geometry, and we can go around and select all of these edges, right? So hold down the Shift key, select that, select this side, select this side, and select this side. So I think I've got all of them. So if we give all of those a hard crease. You see now we're getting darker lines representing the faces that are creased. And if we go back and do our SUBD toggle, we now see that we have generated a very similar form to what we had before. So this is the first step. Now you can come back and change your selection to sub-objects to faces. You can click on these faces. You can extend them, make them longer as you desire. You can make them asymmetrical. So it depends on the proportions of the geometry. And if we toggle back, you begin to see something very similar to the final shape that we ended up with. So this is a SUBD process. We've looked at switching back and forth between the smooth and hard version and introducing creases in the geometry to get the flat faces. The other step I want to go over for SUBDs is how to create edge loops or rings, because this is very useful. So we'll have a look at that before we proceed to making a mold for CNC carving and casting.